Welcome to the BYU-Idaho Tutoring Center videos. Today we're going to be talking about landscape and regional conservation. So previously ecologists were kind of really concerned about saving different species and populations, but now we've kind of shifted some of our focus to saving whole ecosystems or landscapes and communities. And so most of it today is just going to be kind of about the debate and the ideas and the issues concerned what we're going to be doing with the land on Earth that we have, and what land we're going to try to set aside to preserve that biodiversity, and what land we're going to allow ourselves to use. So the first thing we kind of have to understand is landscape structure and how it impacts biodiversity. So we have to start with fragments and edges. So edges are just kind of the boundaries between two different ecosystems, and they have a unique biodiversity. Because they are at the edge, they can take some of the abiotic factors and the biotic factors from both ecosystems. And so sometimes we have species that really thrive at these edges because they kind of get the best of both worlds. And sometimes we have a lot of speciation events there too, so we have a lot of biodiversity. But sometimes we also have species that thrive there that will then harm other species in the surrounding area. So we've noticed as we create more of these edges and fragments by dividing up land and separating kind of these populations from each other and creating these new ecosystems, we're creating these fragments and these edges, and they found that sometimes there's a species that really thrives on living at an edge, and then it will be able to start out-competing other species that don't thrive on the edge, and so we're going to start having some species get harmed and potentially be outcompeted until species diversity is decreased. And then we've also done some experiments, and we found that generally the smaller the fragment that we have that's isolated from each other, the less biodiversity we have, and that kind of just goes back to the idea that if we have more land, we can have more biodiversity. Another thing is movement corridors. So movement corridors are narrow strips of land that connect isolated regions and species. And so as we again start populating and taking away habitat of certain species and populations, we're creating these isolated areas. And so sometimes there's things that will still connect them. And sometimes we can artificially make these movement corridors. So in your book, there's actually a picture of a highway, so it's separating two areas, but they connect the two areas with this type of bridge. And so these movement corridors are important because they can help keep populations and species and ultimately these landscapes alive because we have reduced interbreeding, and we can promote dispersal of these genes so that we don't have reduced genetic variability and more susceptible to have populations decline and become smaller and kind of enter that extinction vortex. However, on the flip side, these movement corridors can also be harmful because they can allow the transmission of potentially dangerous diseases and parasites and things like that. But overall, movement corridors are kind of still being studied, and their effects are being studied, so there's still a lot of research to be done. But just understand kind of what they are, that they can be beneficial because they can promote genetic diversity, or they can be harmful. Now we're going to focus kind of the remainder of the video on protected areas, or areas that we as humans are setting aside to try to preserve some of our biodiversity. So first we need to understand what a biodiversity hotspot is. This is a relatively small area with a high concentration of endemic species, or species that are unique to that specific area. And they also contain a high concentration of endangered and threatened ones. And so we noticed that throughout the world, there are certain places that have kind of the majority of the species that we found on Earth. And that has to do with the amount of sunlight and the amount of precipitation we get. So we found that around the equator, where we have all these tropical rainforests, we tend to find a lot more species than up north or south. And so we've actually done some kind of calculations and things, and we found that about 30% of the bird species that are on our Earth occupy about 2% of Earth's land. And then about a third of the species on land occupy about 1.5% of that land. And so we have a lot of these species concentrated in one area. So if we focus on saving those areas, which is what scientists tend to do, then we can be preserving a lot of biodiversity in a very small area. But keep in mind that how we determine what's a hotspot is usually biased towards vertebrates and plants. Generally that's just because what people connect with better versus the invertebrates, which are insects and the microorganisms. So if you're trying to get some money to preserve some area, if you say, hey, come save the koala or some bird or lizard, people respond better than if you say, come save some microorganism, bacteria that nobody really cares about. So that's kind of why they're more biased towards these vertebrates and plants. And so what we'll do is we will form these natural reserves, and so it's an area that's kind of isolated from human activity, but surrounded by all these areas that have been affected by lots of human activity. And so kind of one of the debates that goes on is, should we have larger reserves that are bigger and less of them, or should we have smaller reserves and more of them, which is more beneficial? And there's kind of a debate going on. There's pros and cons to both of them. So the benefit of having a larger reserve is that a lot of species need a lot more space. So to actually keep the grizzly bear population in Yellowstone up at its minimal viable population, Yellowstone and the area that those grizzly bears occupy would actually have to be like 10 times the size it is. It would go into Idaho and Rexburg area. And so just having these small reserves isn't beneficial all the time because we can't allow these populations to spread out and have the space that they need to survive. However, on the flip side, if we have more small reserves, then that allows or doesn't allow the chance of parasites and disease spreading among these different populations. It's less likely to happen as they're more separated. So then again, if they're more separated, then we can have reduced genetic variability because we have less gene flow and things like that. And so the last thing is zone reserves. These are extensive areas of land that include land that's undisturbed by human activity, that is then surrounded by land that has been changed by human activity. So the land that's been affected by human activity kind of acts as a buffer for the land that they're trying to preserve. And so Costa Rica is actually one of the leading nations in this. They've created 8 zone reserves, and they've been able to preserve a lot of their biodiversity in that area. And we're also concerned about preserving marine ecosystems and landscapes. A lot of times we focus on terrestrial, but there's a lot of biodiversity in the ocean, and so a lot of nations have started moving towards also making these marine reserves and not allowing people to fish and exploit those regions. And we found that there's actually been some economical value and benefits to doing this. As we cut off or make places not able to be allowed to fish, then the biodiversity is able to recover, and we're able to have these really healthy, good populations of fish and different organisms that will then spread out outside of the area that we're not allowed to fish in, and then we'll have better fishing in the areas around. And also, as we preserve this beauty of nature, it allows a lot of tourism and recreation, which then brings economic value to the nation in which they preserved it. So it's not all bad to limit some of our human instincts to kind of take down and get these resources, and because there are some economic values. That's going to be mostly it for today. As we're kind of like the last couple of units in our lectures in ecology, a lot of it's kind of like common sense stuff, or just here's some interesting information. As far as tests and quizzes go, it's going to be more here's some scenario, kind of use common sense to figure out what's going on. And so far, as far as a test goes, the main things you'd probably be like quizzed on is potentially having to know what a movement corridor was, a zone reserve, and then biodiversity is probably going to be a big one that would probably be on a quiz. But don't stress too much about all this ecology stuff. Most students do pretty good on the ecology units, the stuff at the beginning of the unit that you're probably going to want to focus on more than the stuff at the end. Thank you so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.